Welcome everyone. I'm Ira Feldman. Welcome to today's webinar, Semiconductor Test Consumables, The Road Ahead, sponsored by SW Test, Test Connects, and VLI Research. Welcome, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you may be. Welcome to today's webinar. This is session 2. So this is the repeat of the slides from this morning, but it will be a very interactive session. So we encourage your questions via the Q&A tool as we present, and the person moderating will ask the presenter the questions. So these could turn out to be very different presentations depending upon the questions that you ask. So welcome. And so the agenda is Jerry Broz will present the semiconductor test overview, followed by myself talking about tests and test consumables market report, and then John West will close with the changing cost structure of semiconductor test. So our first speaker tonight is Jerry Broz. It's my pleasure to introduce him. Jerry is the Senior Vice President of Technology Development at International Test Solutions, where he started in 2003. Prior to that, he was a Senior Technical Director for MJC Electronics, and before that, he was a member of technical staff in test engineering at Texas Instruments. Jerry has a PhD in mechanical engineering from the University of Colorado at Boulder, and he is the co-chair of the Probes Working Group for the Heterogeneous Integration Roadmap Committee, and more importantly, and I've known him over the years as the general chair of the Semiconductor Wafer Test SW Test Conference that's held in San Diego, and the annual SW Test Asia Conference in Taiwan. So we welcome Jerry. As Jerry presents, please use the Q&A tool to post your questions and we will ask. So Jerry, it is all yours.
So as Ira said, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, good day, depending upon what time zone you happen to be located in. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day for attending this web event, and it's really a pleasure to be able to share some of the information that we have. As Ira said, my name is Jerry Broz, and I'm the SW Test Conference's General Chair, and I also have a paying job, which is the Senior Vice President of Technology Development at International Test Solutions. So the webinar overall is going to be entitled Semiconductor Test Consumables, which is going to be the road ahead. And in my portion, I will be discussing some of the current forecasts for the market, as well as some industry statistics. Quick overview of myself. I've been the SW Test Conference's chair since 2009, and I have participated in the conference since 1995. So over the past 25 years, my focus has been on various aspects of wafer level, package level testing, as well as some cleaning innovations. So a few words about the SW Test conferences. Hopefully most of you are familiar with these, but fundamentally, we've got conferences that are probe technology forums. We strive to bring together some wafer test professionals, probe technologists. For San Diego, we have a 3-day format. And for the past 29 years, we've been really focused on a friendly technical forum that facilitates problem solving and a lot of networking. SW Test Asia is a 2-day conference that's held in Taiwan. Since its inception in 2017, we have extended our overall relaxed format that we really enjoy in San Diego to create a workshop-style conference in Taiwan. Overall, there's been 32 years of combined probe technology with more than 11,000 attendees. So this format is really very receptive, very friendly, and it allows premier exhibits and suppliers, and they all come together in one spot. Both conferences have a very broad technical program, which consists not only of user presentations, but supplier presentations, and a lot of collaborative work. More than 60% of the presentations at both conferences come from international authors. And what we do see are 40% of the presentations tend to be co-work or collaborative types of things, which is really very important for our industry. Collaboration, such as this webinar, are really, really key to it. In 2019, we were very fortunate and we had over 600 attendees at both conferences, not separately, I should say separately, not together. So of those, we see more or less 30% of the participants are coming from IDMs and OSATs. And really, that's a very great mix. It allows for very focused technical exchange. We facilitate some golf tournaments that provide a lot of networking opportunities. We support student travel grants. We've developed some initiatives to help support women in engineering. But overall, we love to meet new people, and basically we want to have a little bit of fun. The biggest value that we see for our conferences is tied to the social interaction and the networking. So it is with a sad heart that this year we had to cancel our conferences. In our tight-knit little technical community, obviously the health and safety of our attendees, sponsors, exhibitors, and the overall community are clearly a top priority. So as with many of the conferences in 2020, there are some major travel restrictions still ongoing. So unfortunately, we had to cancel our conferences this year. Next year, we're hoping to have conferences in San Diego during June 6th through 9th. And then we are working on scheduling our next conference in Asia, and it'll be in Hsinchu, Taiwan at the Sheraton from October 14th through 15th. So keep an eye out for those. We'll be sending out some flyers. So here's the agenda of what we're going to talk about. First, I'll kind of kick off. We're going to look at pre-COVID metrics. And really, what are the expectations of the industry, or actually, what were the expectations of the industry moving into 2020? A lot of the metrics that are available, it took a little bit of digging, but we dug up some information pre-COVID pandemic. The next bit will be weathering through the storm. So it's not necessarily a post-COVID, but it is in the middle of COVID. And then at the end, I will wrap it up with some short-term and long-term expectations. One of the biggest issues that we're facing right now, looking forward, is that it tends to be day by day, and it's really quite a volatile situation. So really what we're going to look at now is kind of looking into the crystal ball, trying to figure out what we're going to be looking at. But before we can really look forward, we got to look where we've been. So at the end of 2019, the expectation for 2020 was a 7% increase in the total. The increase in the industry was really tied to an overall 7% increase. But what we did see from last year was an 8% decline from 2018 to 2019. So really what we're expecting to see this year is a high number of units. However, overall, it has been a relatively predictable demand. So at approximately the growth rate of about 8% a year, the unit volume always seems quite stable, but the fluctuations within the revenues tend to be all over the place. Really starting in 1978 and ending in 2020, we did see approximately a CAGR of 8.6%. So over the 42-year period, even though the market has been relatively cyclic, we do see a overall demand and a desire for purchasing or obtaining semiconductor units. I broke this down into the overall OSD devices, which typically are about 65 to 70%, more like 70% of the total units shipped. And then we break that down with about 31%. We expect to see a lot of growth in all these various categories in 2020. Prior to the pandemic, because these are essential building blocks for everything that's tied to artificial intelligence, cloud computing, big data systems, and deep learning applications. So if we break this down, after the gains of 2018, 2019 was basically considered to be a correction year. And what we saw there was the revenues for the industry into 2019, there was an 8% decline. But behind this, what we're looking at are really a distribution amongst communication, automotive, consumer. So we're really looking at a wide range spreading across this. And these are all being driven through cloud computing, 5G connectivity, smart devices, IoT, and all of this is going to have some substantial performance and data management requirements. Ultimately, the market is driven by the consumer. If we take a look at some of the product distribution, really what we see is a demand for advanced devices. Although there were increasingly greater demands in markets such as Asia, Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Africa, we did see some declines overall in the memory. But again, remember, we're looking at a little bit of a distribution. And so really DRAM and NAND flash revenues overall were observed to decrease. I took an average here, but it was about 25 to 37% in 2019. But overall, the unit shipments, not necessarily the average selling price, still continue to increase. Again, driven by the demand for many of the consumer devices and the consumer requirements. Well, you got to test all these things. So basically, all semiconductor units or all IC units need to be tested and validated. So the probe card industry supports this testing infrastructure. Of course, there's the probers, which are handling the wafers. There's the ATE, which is acting to test it. But as we know, the critical interface between both of these things, between the DUT itself, the ATE, is the probe card. So each year, VLSI Research investigates and summarizes the overall market. So back in 2018, the market was roughly $1.6 billion. We did see a nice growth moving from 2018 to 2019, so 2019 being last year. So overall, an increase in the market for probe cards. But moving into 2020, the expectation was a relatively flat year with not a lot of growth. However, with the coming of the COVID-19 storm, the semiconductor revenues are kind of matching this. In the beginning, they were thinking that it was going to decrease, but this is kind of reflected by this. VLSI also breaks this down into basically five primary categories of probe cards. So blade and tungsten cards, which are often used for parametric and low-end applications. Overall, we've seen fairly consistent distribution towards that end of being fairly small. Epoxy and cantilever cards are historically a workhorse for the industry. And this is tied to the economics as well as some of the cycle times. But these are primarily used for non-memory applications. From the vertical side, these have been starting to migrate more into the MEMS probe card area. So really there is an expectation for just general growth, and this is going to be more tied into market demands, but not necessarily any kind of new innovation. Basically, these probe cards or the demands for these types of technologies are really migrating toward MEMS. MEMS have historically addressed the memory market, but now we're seeing a lot more non-memory applications. And this is basically going to continue with the increase in demand, but we're also going to see some new applications as well as meeting some requirements. And then there's
Jerry,
go ahead.
So a question that was asked, and I think I know the answer, was whether the segmentation of probe card by type, it really isn't including any of the revenue for what I'll call a probe card, you know, spring pin based WLCSP. I don't believe those are in the numbers, but that's the question being asked.
I think on the left-hand side, not so much. I'm going to guess, and John can clarify that a little bit further. Those would probably fall into the other advanced category because that's really highly complex and it could be a high-density probe card. I don't know if John and his group have started breaking that out as part of the overall mix. So. If, you know, when John is able to discuss that, maybe we can raise that question with him.
Okay,
no.
Good.
But overall, what we're seeing is that MEMS really have the fastest growth rate. So if we do some calculations, we're expecting to see a CAGR of MEMS probably due probably around almost 10% over the next 5 years. And that's really tied not just to new applications, but also a growing market demand. We also break out the top suppliers within the industry. So the top 5 probe card companies really made up about 70% of the total market revenues, with the top 3 suppliers basically experiencing 15% on an average of quite a bit of growth. So we do see various strong demands of memory and logic coming out of Samsung and SK Hynix. However, South Korea does have a very large consumption of probe cards. What I found interesting in this chart is there is a decline in TSE, Wiltec, and Microfriend, and that could be tied to price pressures, which John will talk about a little bit later on with the system level test. But it also could be reflective of new probe card companies entering the Korean market. Overall, we're not throwing this in here, but the China market is expecting to increase. And this is really tied to a lot of Chinese investment in the semiconductor industry. So over the next few years, Changxin expects to quadruple their production. So, and they're focused on DRAM chips. And this could potentially be 40,000 wafer starts per month, which that's an amazingly large number, and it's tied to about 3% of the total DRAM market. Yangtze Memory Technologies expects to triple their production by the end of 2020. And that's going to potentially hit a number of 60,000 wafers per month. And that's going to be really hitting about 5% of the worldwide output. So really overall in China, we're expecting to see some things change, but the demand is going to continue to increase over the next 5 years. A little bit of consolidation in this. I do want to point out that Technoprobe did acquire Microfabrica, which was a MEMS supplier. These aren't reflected in these numbers. And then also Star Technologies acquired Excel RF Instruments, and both of these happened in 2020.
So, and Jerry, with the Korean market, I've also heard word that maybe sometimes the designs are lasting longer than they have historically. So the cards have a lot of usable cycles on them, and typically with a DRAM card, you never get to the end of the life of a card. So.
Yeah, the single touch contactors, I mean, there could definitely be some of that. Generally, a single touch contactor is going to be like 16 to 24 months, basically the product cycle of the device. So that could be part of it. Throughout, there's been lore within the industry that there's going to be some sort of standardization of design where you can kind of recycle sort of a generic design for a number of years. Again, it's very difficult to kind of ferret that information out. And really what we could see is probe cards lasting longer, price pressures, of course, trying to drive down the bottom line. And really it's kind of difficult to say if there's kind of an influx of non-Korean companies that are penetrating that market. So, in the pre-COVID scenario, in 2021, global sales were really expected to increase 5.9% and 6% respectively. We did see a decrease, as I mentioned earlier, in 2019 from 2018. But overall, the market was expected to recover in 2020 and show some modest growth. So as we take a look at many of the predictions, a lot of these were extended well before any kind of impact of the pandemic. So all of the analysts were predicting somewhere in the range of maybe 5 to 10%. Kind of the maximum was pushing up here at some of the higher numbers of 10%. Memory again was expected to drop a little bit, but overall the markets were expected to basically grow. So really overall 2020 was expected to be a transformative year across multiple sectors. And what I mean by that is we had 5G, which was going to start being deployed. The frequencies were going to be sold off. The Olympics were going to be very motivated through 5G. There were going to be a lot of connectivity solutions, IoT, of course. and then many, many automotive applications. So that was really going to propel the industry to really grow. Basically, the need for any advanced technology is insatiable. We have seen a number of presentations and a number of technologists discussing that Moore's law is really slowing, but really the common requirements and the demand for performance continue to span all applications. This slide comes from ASML, and they made a presentation during the Semi 3D Package Conference in 2020, early 2020 in January. And what we really see is just overall CAGRs that are positive. The one that was a little bit on the sort of the flat side was for PCs. A lot of that's not a surprise because we all like to carry our smartphones, we all like to carry our tablets. We're seeing this wireless and wired infrastructure growing, and more data, more computing power, and this is all going to be driven by the cloud, connectivity, and networking platforms. Of course, we want smarter devices, we want artificial intelligence. Obviously, we want some automotive or autonomous vehicles. So really, in this economy, companies like Apple, Alphabet, Amazon, the 3As, Facebook, and Tesla are really fueling what would be what was called by the economists the digital economy. Basically, the bottom line or the takeaway message from this is the demand by consumers for advanced technology is truly insatiable, and that's reflected several slides back by just the continuous increase by the number of semiconductor units. So kicking off into 2020, the first quarter was really a good kickoff. Across the board, except for, let's say, Broadcom and TI, everything was really positive. We saw tremendous year-on-year growth. TSMC had a record first quarter. So this was really shaping up to be well beyond the expectations of the initial analysts' overview. So year-on-year first quarter was a nice 16%. And then the COVID crisis changed everything. So I dug out this little chart which really highlights what changed. Online electronics really kicked off. There was a tremendous increase year-on-year for online electronics. But we did see an increase on groceries, but we did see quite a few industries really suffer throughout this. China experienced some of their biggest declines due to that timing. Overall, the smartphone markets went regionally down. So what we did see is a decrease in 10 to 20%, both tied to the supply chain as well as the demand for high-end devices. The shipments dropped, but as the first quarter started to progress, there was an expected year-on-year growth in the second quarter because people moved from a work from home situation, learn from home situation, and now we're seeing, I think it's X from home situation, which is basically everything from home. We did see a tremendous growth in some of the landline equipment, various PC peripherals, webcams, microphones, everything, tremendous growth on a year-on-year. But really the combination of kind of the uncertain business environment and the increased potential for supply chain interruptions really affected what the forecast could potentially be. If we look at some market trending, I pulled this little chart from a presentation that was made by VLSI during TUSCON X, looking at the overall units. But this one, when we take a look, we expect a growth, and we're expecting growth in units. So the charting of the number of units often reflects some of the volatile nature of it. But really, we did see that the revenues were expected to go up. But the issue here now is really the effect of COVID. This is really the storm that we're seeing. And in fact, the overall volatility is really going to affect, at least near term. Long term, that becomes tied to the insatiable demand. And I go back to the insatiable demand for semiconductor units. So let's take a look at how we are weathering it through the overall market. So I broke down 2019 and I categorized it into really 5 major categories: personal computing, data center, smartphone, and automotive, and memory. So if we start looking into 2020, Q1 was really affected by the supply chain disruption. But really, Q2, everything is nearly recovered. And Q2 is really fueled with personal computing. Even though there's a negative number, the demand is actually quite high. And in fact, for 2020, there's an expected decline moving into Q3 and Q4. With the data centers, no surprise. Growth of the networks, computing power, bandwidth, all is surged by work from home, learn from home. And we also see increased network capacity that was driven by government, education, telecom, and a bunch of other services. There really is expected to be continuous growth in the CPU market as well as the memory. Smartphone, there was an initial ramp expected. The frequency auction had to be delayed. I mean, overall, the semiconductor content for processors, RF, memory, power, sensors, and connectivity of smartphones continues to be a expectation of increase. But really, consumers who do rely on their mobile phones are also relying on trying to keep their jobs. So the discretionary spending is not necessarily being passed on. So we're thinking that potentially moving into latter half, probably with the seasonal demand, there'll be an increase. But overall, the market is going to be a little bit on the downside. With automotive, many of the OEMs had shutdowns, there were reduced operations, and what basically that means is that there was an overall decrease in global automotive sales, which is reflected by the number of, by basically the impact on the semiconductor market. Omdia recently indicated that there is a greater than 20% reduction in the sales of power devices expected, and that's really reflecting overall market because power devices are really practically everywhere. The other thing that's going to affect this is that Hertz and Advantage Rent-A-Car in May declared bankruptcy and they're restructuring. But as part of that, they're going to be trying to sell off some of their fleet. That's about 700,000 cars that potentially are going to be sold. If we take a look next at the memory market, there is an increase, which really is not much of a surprise. And the reason that we see that is that strong growth overall, SSD adoption. Again, all of this is being fueled by a lot of these work from home, learn from home, the data centers, data center storage. All of this is in much higher demand. So we're expecting to see that this is going to offset some of the reductions for the overall market. So if we take a look now towards 2021 and 2022, there is really a positive outlook, but basically this could change both from a standpoint of a virus resurgence, or in the US, we see a change in the administration. So there are a lot of factors which could do that. So predicting into 2021, 2022 is pretty difficult, but fundamentally this year is expected to be a relative decline from initial expectations, but overall we're hoping to see a resurgence in 2021 and 2022. One of the things I wanted to highlight is the automotive sector, and I spoke about that just a little bit. But in the past couple of years, the automotive sector by many people has been considered the driver, pardon the pun, of the semiconductor industry. But what we're seeing is year on year, there's about a 30% reduction in initial sales. And then overall, the expectations are actually quite dramatic, especially looking at some of the April sales numbers. What we do see is that the impact of this is tremendous, because what we expect is that going from internal combustion engines to fully electrified vehicles, there's about a 6x per vehicle semiconductor content. So there have been a number of numbers thrown around, but generally what we're seeing is $350 worth of semiconductor content for internal combustion engines. And then once we move to fully electrified with ADAS, there is almost an expectation that it's going to be about $1,700 worth of semiconductor content. Basically, all of this is really tied to our vehicles becoming massive data appliances. And this is more, this chart is really reflective of how we're seeing the reduction of overall vehicles being, well, just an overall reduction of vehicle sales. So overall, there is an expectation of almost 15%. In fact, some analysts are looking at 24% contraction into 2020. The sales and revenue for the semiconductor companies was actually revised pushing into the second quarter. Their overall, the guidance from most of the large manufacturers needed to be adjusted. So there was various levels of decline. A lot of it came from the automotive suppliers like ST Micro. A large portion of their business is tied to automotive. However, we did see growth from Toshiba Semiconductor where they have some memory applications. But overall, the general guidance for Q2 is really caution. What we expect to see is some upper guidance overall, but in general, it's, I think, proceed with care. So if we look at the expectations from April, now we've got some revisions. And what we saw is overall, the analysts were looking at some kind of negative numbers with a little bit of an increase into the future. And in June, the WSTS announced that there was an expectation for growth. VLSI was one of the first companies that came in June to give some positive numbers. But if we take a look at the WSTS forecast, which was announced June 9th, they are expecting a 3.3% growth. It's not that I fixed my numbers in the previous slide, but basically I looked at the numbers and I took an average. And really what we did see is that the wireless segments indeed are going to be hardest hit, which is not a surprise. But fortunately, the Americas and the Asia Pacific regions are going to grow. This is an overview of the chart where we're looking at the different regions. The expectations in 2020 are some declines in Europe and Japan, but overall in the Americas and Asia Pacific, there's going to be a good growth. Go ahead.
So while you're while you're talking about regions, what do you think the impact of the trade war between U.S. and China? And specifically, one other person asked, what about the U.S. attempts to block Huawei? You know, do you think that's going to have any repercussions in the probe card market for U.S. suppliers?
I think, you know, short term, it could. Long term, we are seeing TSMC deploying in the United States. I think a lot of it is going to be tied to is there going to be a change in administration in November? If there is not a change in the administration, then I expect to see some impact into China for sure. If there is a change in the administration, it's really hard to say because it's unknown what kind of policies we're looking at moving forward. So I think this is a sort of a winding answer to basically we'll see. And we really need to kind of be prepared for an impact overall. But also as part of the China 2025 plan, there is a move to basically become self-sustaining. So if we look at the overall distribution of semiconductor into China, China produces, and when I say produces, that means they build it themselves, roughly 20 to 25% of the worldwide market. But they do consume 70 to 80% of the electronics. That doesn't really make sense from not only from a political standpoint, but also from a financial GNP standpoint. So basically with the 2025 plan, there's going to be the growth in the overall semiconductor market. And we would expect to see some growth for probe card consumption. But then the question becomes, will the probe card market, with many of them being based in the US, Are we going to see a influx of probe cards coming from the European makers? Are we going to see a development of probe card technology within China itself? So it's actually a very difficult question to come up with, I would say, what would be a good and reputable answer. So I would say the end, after that winding story, I think that the takeaway message is, let's see.
And I'll also put a plug in for a webinar I'm hosting next Wednesday. It's at the MEPTEC IMAPS Semiconductor Industry Speaker Series. Stephen Rothrock from AT-Reg is going to talk about the impact of the US-China trade wars on the OSATs. So if you're interested in that, you can sign up for free at meptec.org. So
yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep. So basically, what we can see is recovery is happening. So this morning we shared these charts, and basically here in January, we're looking at the start of the COVID lockdowns. So on this chart, after speaking with the group from VLSI Research, this is roughly an 80% utilization metric. And so as we move here, we're almost at 100%. So what we saw as moving into the second half of this, more than 80% of the China workforce has really returned back to work. And from what I've been reading, almost 100% of the large enterprises have really restarted their operations. So, you know, basically now from the wafer fab utilization standpoint, test utilization and assembly utilization, we are really kind of moving back and almost at the point of business as usual. But we do certainly see that the demand is on track. And in fact, from what John mentioned this morning, not trying to steal anything from him, but compared to the same time last year, we're actually seeing an increase of approximately 6% this year versus what we saw a year ago. And really, this uptick in silicon demand is partly tied to the emergence of the e-commerce and work at home, but it could potentially be offset by some of the weaknesses in the automotive and industrial sectors. But fundamentally, in talking with my colleagues who are in the probe card market, they've had really quite a dynamic Q1 and Q2. But overall, we're seeing roughly a 25% growth in revenues year on year during Q1 and Q2. So basically, probe card companies are busy, the semiconductor is busy, and test is busy. We are definitely seeing some kind of sector effects, but overall, things seem to be recovering. So to kind of close it up, I mean, for the moment, the outlook still remains uncertain with the possible reoccurrence, and really what's going to happen is the new normal. That's going to be what's going to be really defining it. But right now, today, if we were expected to make a prediction, the semiconductor market is expected to grow 3 to 6%. And during the second half, you know, there could be double-digit growth into 2021. It's really hard to say. Automotive is expected to really suffer throughout. Unfortunately, driving a car right now isn't all that important. Buying a new car is not that important. But what we do expect to see is that many of the key systems, such as servers, edge infrastructure, and PCs, will continue to uptick. The data center demands are clearly going to remain healthy, especially with the way that we're moving. Significant differences, what we do see in short term, and as I just mentioned, for automotive, industrial, we're going to see those really likely affected. I mean, even though 5G needs advanced technologies, it comes at a price. So discretionary funding could potentially be affecting that. And again, we look at automotive. The markets that we would expect least likely affected, of course, data centers, because everyone wants to watch Netflix, they want to play games. But there's also the webinars and Zoom and that sort of thing. Medical, that's really a new opportunity. You know, on the downside, we do expect to see more medical and not downside money-wise, but downside philosophically wise, and of course some artificial intelligence. Really, the bottom line and the takeaway message is that end user demands always are going to drive long-term performance. So really, new applications and the consumer requirements, this is all going to push it forward. So what we expect to see, there'll be a demand from the retailers, there'll be a demand from the hospitality sectors, but overall, until the travel bans are removed, there's going to be a difficulty just moving forward. Of course, the foundries, advanced logic and memory, at least for the moment, are staying healthy. But what we do expect to see that, and maybe this will happen into next year, but again, it really depends. But trade shows, conferences, business travels could potentially return with a fervor with this kind of catch-up mentality. So basically, also to kind of piggyback on what Ira mentioned, tomorrow, Semi is putting on a outlook, which is looking at emerging markets and the impact of COVID-19 for the supply chain. So I'm sure there'll be some discussion as far as the trade war is concerned, particularly here. We're looking at US and China tensions. So I would say sign up for this. It's $25 for Semi members and $100 for non-Semi members, but I've attended a couple of these in the past and they're always really quite good. So basically with that, I'd like to wrap it up, and I would say thank you very much for attending. I appreciate you guys taking the time out of your day to listen to what we've got to say. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.